The first thing Thomas Grady noticed was how wrong the ocean felt. The water, usually teeming with movement, was eerily calm. No birds, no splashes, just endless flat blue. It was the kind of quiet that didn't soothe, it unsettled. He had been out for nearly 6 hours, chasing tuna along a stretch of Gulf waters he'd fished for years, and caught nothing but silence and sunburn. Then he saw it, far out, too far, a dark shape bobbing between waves. At first he thought it was driftwood, maybe debris from a passing trawler, but it didn't move with the current. It fought it. He grabbed his binoculars, raised them, and the breath left his chest. It was a dog, a German shepherd, swimming alone. Thomas dropped the binoculars and spun the wheel hard. The boat sliced across the still sea, throttle roaring, cutting distance fast, but not fast enough. Even through the chop he could see the dog struggling. Its legs moved weakly, head dipping under, then jerking back above. Mouth open, gasping. Each wave threatened to be its last. "Hold on, buddy," Thomas muttered, already tossing a rope ladder overboard. "Don't quit now." He didn't wait for logic, he didn't need answers, he dove. The water punched the air from his lungs, cold, sharp, but he swam harder than he had in years. The dog didn't respond when he reached him, just sank limply into his arms, too exhausted to even react. Thomas kicked back toward the boat, dragging the shepherd with one arm, the weight pulling against him like an anchor of desperation. It took everything he had, but he got him on board. The dog collapsed on the deck, soaked and shaking, ribs showing through tangled fur. His paws were shredded, his breathing shallow, but he was alive. Thomas knelt beside him, one hand over the dog's side. "You made it," he whispered. "God, I don't know how, but you did. There was no collar, no tag, no chip. Nothing except one small, rusted fragment of metal caught in the dog's matted fur near the neck." Thomas pulled it free. It looked like it had been part of a tag or tracking plate. Almost everything on it was worn away, except for a single carved letter. Thomas stared at it, heart still pounding. 135 miles from shore, no boat in sight, no rescue call, no ID. And somehow this dog had survived. That night Thomas didn't go to animal control. Something deep inside him resisted that. Instead, he drove the shepherd to a quiet vet clinic just outside Clearwater. He carried the dog in himself, wrapped in a towel. The receptionist barely had time to speak before Thomas said it. "I found him swimming, 135 miles offshore." The room went silent. Within minutes, the vet was examining him. Dehydrated, wounded, exhausted, but alive. And when she looked up, she said something that chilled Thomas more than the salt in his clothes. "There's no chip, no tattoo, no identification, but the way he's built, the way he's trained to stay calm, even in this state. This isn't just someone's pet." Thomas sat in the waiting room, dripping seawater onto the tile floor, staring at the rusted fragment still clenched in his fist. That letter R felt like the start of something bigger. This dog hadn't just been lost, he had been left. And now Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that someone was going to come looking for him, not to save him, but to silence him. Thomas didn't sleep that night. The image of the dog's face, soaked, breathless, clinging to life in an ocean that should have swallowed him whole, stayed behind his eyes every time he blinked. Even in the stillness of his small cabin, with the waves gently brushing the dock outside, his mind wouldn't stop asking the same question. How does a German shepherd end up over 100 miles offshore? The vet had said he'd make it, dehydrated, weak, scraped up, but no internal damage, no broken bones. "He's a fighter," she had said with a kind of awe in her voice. "Dogs don't last more than a few hours in open sea. This one swam days." Thomas believed it now. The shepherd was sleeping on a folded blanket beside the fireplace. His breathing was shallow, steady. His body didn't twitch or spasm in pain. It rested like that of a soldier who'd finally reached a safe perimeter. Thomas sat nearby, watching. The flames flicker and dance. The metal tag with the carved R lay on the table next to him. He turned it over in his fingers again and again. There had to be more to it. A name, a unit, a purpose. but it had been ground down to a single letter, like someone didn't want anything traceable left behind. By morning, the dog was awake. Again, he didn't whimper, didn't bark. He just sat up slowly, locked eyes with Thomas, and held the gaze, not out of fear or confusion, but with something deeper. Calculated calm. Thomas slid a bowl of water toward him. The shepherd licked, cautiously, methodically. No mess. No gulping. Then he stood, unsteady at first, but not uncoordinated. He walked the perimeter of the room, every corner, every door, every window. His eyes scanned the walls, then the ceiling. This wasn't a stray trying to adjust to a new home. He was a trained animal performing a perimeter check. Thomas followed him with growing unease. "I knew it," he muttered. He waited until the dog settled back down near the front door, then pulled out his old military field journal and started flipping through pages, past contacts, past missions, scraps of code names from years ago. He hadn't been active in a TAC. Long time, but muscle memory didn't fade. Neither did instincts. He opened his laptop, accessed an encrypted channel he hadn't touched since the day he signed his discharge papers, and started digging. Not through public records. Those wouldn't hold anything like this. He went deeper. Restricted files, covert mission logs, private defense contractors. He searched for K9 units marked R, then R7, then just asset POOR. Nothing, for a while. Then something pinged. A redacted entry buried under layers of blackout screens. Partially corrupted. Barely accessible. Asset R7 deployment status. Terminated location, Gulf Operational Waters designation. Tactical recon, Black Zone clearance mission status. Failed subject, lost at sea. Thomas leaned back in his chair. Ranger wasn't just trained. He had been deployed. This wasn't a family dog that fell overboard. This wasn't some accident. He had been sent out with a purpose. And when something went wrong, they wrote him off like discarded equipment. But the dog had refused to die. And now, for the first time, he was somewhere he wasn't being used. Thomas looked across the room. The shepherd, he'd started calling him Ranger, was still near the door, one paw tucked under his chest. But his ears were perked, eyes watching. "Listening. Who sent you?" Thomas whispered. "And what did they lose when you came back?" Ranger blinked slowly. No answers. But now, Thomas wasn't just curious. He was in it. And he had a growing suspicion they hadn't just left Ranger behind. They were coming to clean up what survived. For 2 days, things stayed quiet. Thomas spent the time watching Ranger recover, if you could call it that. The shepherd had regained strength faster than expected. He was eating steadily now, walking with purpose, even tailing Thomas through the cabin with calm precision. But there was a weight in his eyes, something Thomas recognized from his own years in covert operations. Not fear, not confusion. Awareness, a hyper-calm, calculated presence that never shut off. It wasn't how a rescued dog behaved. It was how a soldier moved through hostile terrain. Ranger didn't bark. He didn't flinch at storms or slam his body into doors when Thomas stepped outside. But when a delivery truck backfired near the road, he dropped to the floor instantly. Chest to the ground, eyes scanning, ears locked forward. Thomas knew that posture. He'd done it himself years ago, pinned behind cover in hostile waters off Indonesia. That night, he opened the encrypted database again, searching for keywords buried. Beneath blacked-out files, Nightmark, R7K9 asset, offshore deployment. Every query turned up fragments. No mission details, no handlers, no official records. But one thing stood out. The deployment date listed in the corrupted R7 file had been exactly 4 days before he found Ranger swimming alone. 4 days. That meant whoever sent him out there likely assumed he was dead. But if that file had triggered any monitoring alerts, someone now knew the asset had resurfaced. And if they had half a brain, they'd know exactly where to start looking. Thomas looked at Ranger, asleep beside the door, then at the piece of metal tag still sitting on the table, worn, salt-crusted, marked with a fading R. It wasn't just a leftover tag. It was a breadcrumb. The next morning he confirmed it. Just after dawn, a vehicle slowed as it passed the edge of his property. Not a neighbor. Not the mailman. A matte black SUV with no front plates, dark tinted windows, and a small antenna, just barely visible on the roof. It didn't stop. It didn't even hesitate. But Ranger noticed. He was already standing when Thomas stepped onto the porch. The dog hadn't growled, hadn't whined. He just stood, tail stiff, muscles locked in stillness, as his eyes followed the vehicle down the road like a sniper locking onto a scope. "They know," Thomas muttered. Later that day he packed the essentials: food, dry bags, 2 burner phones, cash, and a hard copy printout of the corrupted R7 file. The moment he zipped the duffel shut, Ranger stood and waited at the door, like he knew they weren't coming back. Thomas had planned on heading north, deeper into wooded country where cell service dropped and the roads turned to gravel. But by the time he stepped out to load the truck, he saw fresh tracks in the mud that hadn't been there the night before. Heavy tires, wider tread than any local pickups, government grade. They had already been watching. He and Ranger left through the backwoods trail. No headlights, no engine noise. Just an old dirt road that led to an abandoned diving dock Thomas had used during his contract years. It wasn't on any maps. The cabin there was more shed than home, but it was safe, surrounded by cliffs and trees, invisible from the air unless you knew exactly where to look. That night, Thomas finally spoke the words out loud. "You weren't just abandoned," he said, seated on the floor beside Ranger. "They sent you out to do something, and when it got compromised, they shut it all down, burned the mission, erased the logs, and left you to sink." Ranger didn't react like a normal dog. He didn't tilt his head or wag his tail. He stared into the flickering lantern light with a stillness that unnerved Thomas more than any bark ever could. He understood. Thomas picked up the broken tag and held it between them. "R7, huh? That's what they called you." Then he set it down gently on the wooden floor. Not anymore. The wind howled outside, but inside that forgotten cabin, something unspoken passed between them. Something forged in survival and hardened by the people who tried to make them disappear. They weren't running anymore. They were preparing. Morning arrived heavy with fog. The dock outside the cabin creaked under the weight of dew, and the surrounding forest was cloaked in ghostly silence. Thomas stood at the edge of the wooden planks, a mug of black coffee in hand, staring across the mist-veiled cove. Behind him, Ranger was awake and alert, sitting at the doorway, eyes sweeping the tree line without moving his body an inch. Even now, days removed from the initial rescue, he still hadn't let his guard down. It wasn't instinct. It was programming. Discipline learned through repetition and consequence. Thomas turned toward him. "You ever rest, partner?" Ranger didn't blink. Thomas stepped back into the cabin, opened the satchel he'd stashed the night before, and pulled out a hard copy file, one he hadn't dared dig through until now. He spread the pages across the table, notes printed from the corrupted R7 archive. Most were incomplete, filled with black bars and half-finished entries, but one line stood out like a bloodstain in snow. Asset compromised during Phase 2. Unauthorized human contact suspected. Contingency deployed. Thomas ran his hand down his face slowly, trying to make sense of what it implied. Unauthorized. Human contact. That wasn't accidental. It meant Ranger had chosen not to follow orders. It meant something in him had broken from protocol. Dogs didn't go rogue without cause. He wasn't malfunctioning. He had made a decision. But what happened during that mission? What had he seen? Thomas reached into the bottom of the bag and pulled out the small USB stick he had found tucked inside one of the folders. No markings. No label. It had been wedged between documents as if hidden on purpose. He slid it into his laptop and waited. A folder appeared. 3 short video files. The first showed grainy drone footage from above. A naval vessel, unmarked, moving quietly through restricted waters. The second was thermal imaging, figures moving below deck. The third, Thomas exhaled when it opened. It was body cam footage, mounted low to the ground. Silent, clean, a German shepherd's perspective. Through the distorted lens, Ranger's path unfolded. Tight hallways, dark corners, gloved hands reaching out, a flash of red light. Then the camera shook violently. A man's voice shouted. Gunfire, screams. The image tipped and blurred before going black. Then nothing. The timestamp was 3 days before Thomas found Ranger at sea. He pulled the USB out slowly, pulse pounding. This wasn't surveillance. This was infiltration. And Ranger had been in the middle of something that went very, very wrong. A soft growl rumbled from the doorway. Thomas turned quickly. Ranger hadn't moved from his spot, but his eyes were fixed through the fog at something Thomas couldn't see yet. He crossed the room, careful not to make noise, and crouched beside him. That's when he heard it too. A car engine, slow, controlled, tires crunching against gravel. They'd been found. Thomas didn't panic. He grabbed the documents, stuffed them back in the satchel, then looked Ranger dead in the eyes. If this is it, you stay behind me. Got it? The shepherd didn't flinch. The black SUV emerged from the mist exactly as Thomas had imagined it would. Silent, matte, and deliberate. It rolled to a stop 20 feet from the edge of the dock. 2 men stepped out, suits, earpieces. But it was the third figure that made Ranger freeze, not in fear but in recognition. A man in black boots and a plain gray field jacket. Older, scar across his chin. No hesitation in his walk. The shepherd's ears dropped. He knew him. Thomas stood firm, keeping Ranger behind. Him as the man approached. No weapons were drawn, no warning shouted. He just walked right up to the edge of the dock, stopped, and looked past Thomas toward the dog. R7, the man said calmly. Stand down. We're here to bring you. Ranger didn't move, but the low growl building in his chest told Thomas everything. He didn't want to go back, and whatever this man meant by home, it wasn't safe. Thomas stepped forward. His name isn't R7, and he's not yours anymore. The man didn't argue. He just sighed and said something that made Thomas's blood run cold. Then you've got no idea what you're involved in. Thomas didn't move. He stood at the edge of the dock, body tense, eyes locked on the man who had just called the dog by a name that no longer belonged to him. Behind him, Ranger stood frozen, legs braced, tail down, chest rising and falling in tight, shallow breaths. But it wasn't fear that held him still. It was something deeper. Recognition. History. The man stepped forward again. You have no idea what he's carrying. Thomas didn't flinch. I know enough. No, you don't, the man said flatly. That dog was part of something that went beyond what you'd even call covert. We didn't just train him. We embedded data inside his neural patterns, coordinates, records, fail-safes. He wasn't just a witness, he was the mission. Thomas narrowed his eyes. So when it failed, you dumped him in the ocean and hoped no one would ever find him. The man's jaw twitched. There were complications. The extraction team was compromised. His handler was killed. The protocol was clear. Terminate the asset. Erase the trail. It wasn't personal. Maybe not for you, Thomas said, but it damn sure was for him. The man's eyes shifted slightly, just for a moment. He survived longer than we expected, but that doesn't change what he is. Thomas turned and looked at Ranger, who still hadn't moved. The shepherd's eyes were fixed on the man, but they flicked to Thomas's face just briefly, as if waiting, not for a command, but for permission. Thomas crouched beside him. You don't owe them anything. Whatever they made you do, whoever they told you to be, that's over now. You're not a tool. You're not a code name. You're just you. Ranger looked at him, and for a moment, the fog, the tension, the past, all of it dropped away. Then he stepped forward. Thomas rose quickly, unsure what the shepherd would do, but Ranger didn't attack. He didn't growl or bark or bare his teeth. He walked slowly up to the man, in the gray jacket, and stopped just a few feet away. The man crouched. There you are. That's it. You remember me. Ranger's ears twitched. His head tilted slightly, and then he did something no one expected. He turned away, walked back toward Thomas, and sat beside him. The man's face changed. The professional mask cracked for the first time. There was something like disappointment in his eyes, but also understanding. "You're choosing him," he said quietly. "Even after everything." Thomas put a hand on Ranger's back. "He already did." The man stood slowly, stepped back and signaled to the others. "Stand down, we're leaving." "You're just walking away?" Thomas asked. The man gave a small, bitter smile. "He's not mine to control anymore, and if he still carries what we think he does, you're the one taking the risk now." "Then I'll take it," Thomas said, "and I'll protect him." The SUV door opened. The man climbed in. The vehicle backed up, turned silently, and disappeared into the fog, without another word. Just like that. It was over. Thomas stood on the dock for a long moment, the wind brushing past him, the tension finally beginning to unravel from his shoulders. Ranger leaned against his leg, not shaking, not hiding, just present, grounded. They didn't speak on the way back to the cabin. They didn't need to. That night, the stars broke through the clouds, casting silver light across the quiet water. Thomas built a small fire in the pit beside the porch. Ranger curled beside him, closer than usual, his head resting lightly against Thomas's boot. For the first time since he'd pulled the shepherd from the ocean, Thomas saw his chest rise and fall with full, easy breaths. No tension, no restlessness, just peace. The rusted tag lay on the table beside them. Thomas picked it up, turned it in his fingers one last time, then reached out and pressed it into the soft dirt by the fire. He covered it gently with a palmful of earth. "Goodbye, R7, he said softly. He looked down at the dog resting beside him. "Welcome home, Ranger." The flames cracked quietly. The water lapped against the dock, and beneath the stars, a man and a dog sat together, not as rescuer and survivor, not as soldier and weapon, but as something simple, something sacred. Two lives that had refused to be erased.